You'll find it easily. But it was a new report geared to the transition. Obviously, we started working on this, a larger group. I was just one of the contributors. There were a number of other contributors and editors involved. We started working on this last summer, not really knowing whether Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump would win the election. Of course, my own view was that Trump would win, but it was really proposed as a transition document to help whichever administration came in to understand these linkages. And the way to understand it, I think listeners can just think of a simple Venn diagram, just two big circles. One circle is, think of it as defense, intelligence, national security, diplomacy, all those aspects of national security broadly defined. The other circle is global capital markets, so that would be stocks, bonds, commodities, derivatives, obviously gold, foreign exchange, et cetera. And imagine these two circles intersecting, so they converge and there's some overlap. Well, that overlap where national security issues and global economic issues come together, let's call it geoeconomics for a word, that's really my specialty. That's the area I work in and this group works in. But that area is getting larger and larger. In other words, it's difficult to think of a national security issue today that is not also an economic issue. One of the reasons for that, going back to the Obama administration, there were a lot of confrontations with Russia, with North Korea, others, and even going back further through the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, where for whatever reason the United States did not want to use military force, but did not want to be uninvolved or let people do whatever, countries do whatever they wanted. So we used economic sanctions. Nobody wanted to start a war in North Korea, but we wanted to put economic pressure on them to stop their nuclear program. Nobody wanted to start a war in Iran, but we wanted to put economic pressure on Iran, again, with regard to their uranium enrichment program. And then there were just kind of rogue states like Syria where we would use economic sanctions to try to make it more difficult for the regime in power. So this whole area of economic warfare, financial warfare, there's an even more specialized part of it called cyber financial warfare, using cyber techniques which can affect any part of the critical infrastructure. So that could affect dams or hydroelectric plants or the power grid, et cetera, but aim it specifically at banks, stock exchanges, financial message traffic systems like SWIFT, et cetera, and try to disrupt people's economies. When you think about what's called kinetic warfare, kinetic is, bombs and tanks and things that shoot or explode, physical force, in other words. What is the purpose of kinetic warfare? Well, it's usually degrade the economic power of your opponent. World War II, in other wars, we're bombing railroad depots, we're bombing pipelines, we're bombing factories. We're doing all that not only to attack military forces, but also to degrade the economy. Well, if you can do all that with sanctions and cyber financial warfare, you can skip the bombs. In other words, you can get the same effect using these other 21st century cyber financial techniques. So that's what our center does, and we just released this report. Again, it'll go to the Trump administration, go to senior officials in the Trump administration, but it was really a bipartisan approach calling attention to this. Now, my particular contribution, I wrote a section of it. I didn't write the whole thing, and I did help others produce it, involved gold. And I thought that was where I could make the greatest contribution, because even though there were a lot of scholars, as you know, and as our listeners know, I certainly regard gold as money. I regard gold as the foundation of the international monetary system. But that's a bit of a minority view. Most people, most certainly mainstream economists, central bankers, and others you talk to in the economics profession and policymakers think gold's kind of a joke. They're like, well, yeah, we have some, but, as Ben Bernanke said, it's a tradition, or we don't think it plays any role, or they'll quote John Maynard Keynes saying it's a barbarous relic. And we all know the rap on gold, and I went through this in my book, The New Case for Gold, where I took these objections one by one and deconstructed them and refuted them and showed that they don't hold up. And we've talked about that in prior calls. I don't need to repeat that whole analysis. It is, as I say in the book, The New Case for Gold. But it's fair to say that most economists, most analysts know gold very much, and yet I think about it quite a bit, not only in monetary terms, but also in strategic terms. So since this was for the new president, it will go to Trump's cabinet members and others. I thought it was a good opportunity to inject gold into the discussion. Here's the point I made. This is all obviously factual based. There's something I call the axis of gold. And I presently include 4 countries, although I could include others perhaps over time. And they are Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey. And, you probably need to include North Korea in some ways, but let's just start with those 4. And what do I mean by the axis of gold? Number one, they are all acquiring massive amounts of gold. And we've spent a lot of time in the past talking about the Russia-China story. Russia has tripled their gold reserves in the last 10 years from, round numbers, from about 600 tons to 1,800 tons. China has done likewise officially, but unofficially we estimate that they have even more gold than they admit. China has also gone from about 600 tons to 800 tons that they acknowledge, but my estimate is they probably have 3,000 or 4,000 tons, perhaps more, kind of off the books in the State Administration for Foreign Exchange. So the Russia-China story is pretty well known. Less well known is the Iranian story. We have even less information on Iran than we do on China, but just because Iran is an outlier and a bit of a pariah in the international financial system, there's not a lot of gold mining output in Iran. There is in China, by the way. China's the largest gold producer in the world from a mining perspective, producing, at least for the time being, about 450 tons a year. That's more than twice as much as the next closest country. But Iran is not. So Iran gets their gold from abroad, but where do they get it? Well, a lot of it comes in from Turkey, as a matter of fact. It was transshipped through Turkey. Some of it is smuggled in from Dubai. Dubai is right across the Straits of Hormuz. I've been to Dubai a number of times. The smuggling boats they're down on the waterfront, these dhows. It's called Banias Road, and they're all lined up. And you see boxes full of HP printers and Sony TVs and Apple iPhones and all that, but who knows what's inside the boxes? Probably a fair amount of gold in there. So they bring it in that way. But so they fly it in from Turkey. They smuggle it in by boat from Dubai. But they recently got billions of dollars of gold courtesy of the United States of America. Remember, I'm sure our listeners are familiar with President Obama's efforts to induce Iran to sign this deal that would, in theory, defer their uranium enrichment program for 10 years and sort of slow down their stretch or their effort to become a nuclear power. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the deal itself. There's certainly enough critics out there. I think our listeners can find out all they need to know about that. But part of the deal was that the U.S. would release some funds that we froze years ago that were owned by Iran, and also provide other money that, candidly looked a little bit more like a ransom for some hostages, but leaving that aside. But the amount was well over $10 billion. Over $1 billion was in the form of cash. When I say cash, I don't mean a wire transfer. I mean physical banknotes. Of course, we couldn't give them U.S. dollars. We actually had to call the Central Bank of the Netherlands and do a swap with them, and they sent large denomination euro notes to Iran. Iran doesn't want dollars, by the way. They're pretty much out of the dollar system. They'll take euros and they'll take other forms of money, including gold. But included with these ransom payments was, I don't know the exact amount. I don't know that that's ever been disclosed, but you can think of it as billions of dollars of gold. Certainly several hundred tons, perhaps more. So they're all accumulating gold. Now, why are they doing this? They're doing it for a couple reasons. One is to insulate themselves or protect themselves from U.S. dollar inflation. So the U.S. probably has an unmanageable, non-sustainable debt problem approaching $20 trillion of debt. That wouldn't be so bad if the economy were growing fast enough to pay it, but it's not. Our annual deficits are over 3% of GDP. Our growth is around 2%. Well, if you grow your deficits faster than your economy is growing, you're going broke. You may be going broke slowly, but you're heading on the same path as Greece. And then, of course, the Trump administration is talking about $1 trillion of critical infrastructure spending over and above the existing deficit. So all this looks completely non-sustainable. But there is one way to deal with it, which is inflation. If you can generate enough inflation, the real value of the debt goes down, and you end up paying it with cheaper dollars. You just print the money and pay it off. Well, who has the most dollars in the world of a single entity? Well, the answer is China. They've got well over $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury notes that are vulnerable to devaluation through inflation. So China can't dump those. The Treasury market's big, but it's not that big, and China knows it. And if they tried to do it in a malicious way, the president could stop them with one phone call. So what they're doing is they're letting it run off little by little. They've shortened the maturity structure every month. They that goes by, a certain number of those treasuries mature, and China just gets the money, but they don't have to sell anything. They don't have to dump them. They just kind of run off. But then it begs the question, well, what do you do with the money? And, of course, one of the things they're doing is buying gold. Now, some people have speculated that they're trying to come up with a gold-backed yuan. I find that highly improbable. There are many, many reasons why the yuan is not ready for prime time, why it's not in a good position to be a global reserve currency, even though the IMF says it is. I think the IMF bent the rules to do that for political reasons. But the yuan is not ready. But for a lot of, they don't have a bond market. They don't have a rule of law. They don't have repos, futures, options, dealers, auctions. They don't have all of that plumbing and infrastructure you need to run a bond market so that people who have your currency have something to invest in. It just doesn't exist and won't for at least 10 years, perhaps longer. So they don't have enough gold to back the currency. The People's Bank of China has printed more money than the Fed. People like to beat up the Fed about printing money, and they should, and they printed, close to $4 trillion since 2008. But the People's Bank of China has printed even more with less gold than the United States, and so they're not ready for that. But what they are doing is creating a hedge. So let's say that there is no inflation, that the dollar is stable. I don't expect that, but let's just assume that's true. The gold might not do very much. The dollar price of that gold might not do very much, but China will be happy because they'll get their treasury securities paid off in real dollars. On the other hand, I think this is far more likely, if we inflate the currency, so we say to China, hey, China, here's your $1 trillion, good luck buying a loaf of bread because we printed all the money, China could shrug and say, well, yeah, maybe our treasuries are worth less because of inflation, but our gold is worth more. In other words, without dumping a single treasury and while continuing to have a substantial investment in U.S. dollars, the physical gold acts as a hedge so that if we resort to inflation, which in my view we will, the gold will be worth more and their wealth will be preserved. Now, by the way, that's a reason for every investor to have allocation of gold. I recommend 10%, but people can do more or less according to their personal preferences. But if nothing else, gold is good if the monetary system collapses. It's good in a panic. It always preserves wealth in the long run. There are many, many reasons to have gold in your portfolio, but one of the most obvious and one that people get is inflation insurance. So I'd like to say if it's good enough for China, it's good enough for me, and I do recommend savers and investors allocate some of their portfolio to physical gold for that reason. That's exactly what China's doing. Russia is doing something similar, but I think Russia's more aggressive. They're actually looking for ways out of the dollar payment system, maybe create a ruble zone. The ruble is also not ready to be a global reserve currency, but it could be an effective regional reserve currency, meaning something that trading partners would accept. Those trading partners would include places like Kazakhstan, Belarus, Crimea, obviously, is part of Russian Federation now, and Turkey, which is a major trading partner of Russia. So that could be effective. It is the inflation hedge that I described in the Chinese situation, but it's also a form of wealth. Now, Iran is not very plugged into the global payment system. They've been in and out of SWIFT. Some of the sanctions are starting to ease up, but now the Trump administration is slapping them back on again. Obama put them on through the end of 2013 to get Iran to the bargaining table. Once Iran came to the bargaining table to talk about the uranium enrichment program, Obama started to alleviate the sanctions, which he did to a great extent, not completely, but to a great extent. And now that Trump's in, Trump is slapping the sanctions back on again because Iran is violating the agreement with missile tests. By the way, switching back and forth between sanctions and gold and dollars and missiles, well, I hope that makes my point that the geopolitical and the economic are converging and are very, very closely related. So for Iran, it's an alternate form of wealth. Look, gold is fungible. It's non-digital. You can't hack it. You can't erase it. If you take it to a refinery, and even if you receive bars with serial numbers on them, and stamps and assay stamps and so forth, big deal. Melt them down and make your own bars with your own new serial numbers. It's an element. It's atomic number 79. That is completely untraceable. So you can turn gold in one form into gold in another form. It's still gold, but in such a way that it can't be traced. Now, Iran's motives are a lot more nefarious, which is I talked about Turkey also, and Turkey has confronted NATO, confronted the United States, and they're somewhere between Iran and Russia in terms of looking for alternate stores of wealth on the one hand, but also thinking about what happens if you get kicked out of the financial system. How can you conduct trade and settle your balance payments? Now let's introduce North Korea. North Korea might be the most dangerous spot in the world. We certainly hear about confrontations in eastern Ukraine, the South China Sea, the Senkaku Islands off of Japan. There are enough hot spots to go around, but North Korea may be the most volatile, the most dangerous. So North Korea is obviously testing intercontinental ballistic missiles. They don't have one that works consistently yet, but they're getting better at it. They're moving in that direction. You know, when they fire a missile and it fails or blows up or falls into the sea, everyone says they failed. But in their minds, they didn't fail. They learned something. They are a learning organization. So failures are not really failures. They point to something that can be improved, and then you do better the next time. So they're weaponizing their uranium and plutonium, making it smaller. They're increasing the distance of their missiles. They're not there yet, but they're getting closer to being able to fire a nuclear missile on Seattle and kill millions of Americans. Now, we're not going to let that happen, which means that the U.S. is set up to attack North Korea, you know, with air power and bunker buster bombs and maybe something even more powerful than that, to degrade and destroy their weapon systems, their enrichment programs, and their missile testing systems. But in the meantime, you know, North Korea is going down this path. Well, why are they doing that? Well, look, this is you know, 98% of the people are practically eating bark off of trees. They're starving and they're suppressed, but a very small elite live fairly well, live with a lot of luxury goods. But that's how Kim Jong-un bribes his own military commanders and spy chiefs and elites and others with Western goods and Western money. But how do they get money? Because they're not integrated with the international monetary system. Well, one of the ways is gold. Why are they developing these programs? Do they really want to attack Seattle? You can't rule it out, but what they really want to do is sell it to Iran, right? And then Iran can use it against Israel, and Iran pays for it with gold.